Cultivation refers to the production of plant and animal food, and most societies in the world today practice some type of cultivation. But the switch from foraging to cultivation is a big one in human history, and what we're going to see is that there have been many times throughout history that forager groups have made this transition, and ultimately the switch from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to producing one's own food has been responsible for the large populations, large civilizations that we see throughout the last 10,000 years of human history. So let's remember that until about 15,000 years ago, all humans were foragers. All humans practiced this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. From some of our earliest ancestors in East Africa to Neanderthals and early humans, if we think about cavemen, we're talking about hunter-gatherers, people who hunted wild animals and gathered wild plants. If we recall from earlier in the semester, around 50, 60, 70,000 years ago, there was this out of Africa to migration, where members of our species, Homo sapiens, who had evolved here in East Africa, started migrating out of Africa into Europe, into Asia. Some make it down into Australia by about 50,000 years ago. Other populations make their way into eastern Siberia, and then some of those groups travel around across the Bering Strait into Alaska and down into North and South America by about 15,000 years ago. So by 15,000 years ago, we have hunter-gathering human groups everywhere in the planet except for Antarctica. 15,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers across the planet, and that is the only way of subsistence for humans at this time. Now, subsistence refers to how people support themselves and their family, and typically we're talking about food. Food is one of these things that we can't get away from, and every human society is structured in large part by how they get the food to support themselves. So there are 5 main types of subsistence. Foraging is one, getting all of one's resources from the wild. But today we're focusing on cultivation, which includes horticulture, agriculture, and pastoralism. The 5th subsistence strategy is industrialism, which is what we practice in the United States. These 3 types of cultivation, they all share something in common, which is that people are producing their own food, but each of these has very distinct characteristics, so we'll go through these one by one. Horticulture is the cultivation of plant foods that does not make intensive use of complex systems. This isn't a very expanded definition because it's saying that horticulture does not use complex systems, so it's easier to understand horticulture if we compare it to agriculture, which is the cultivation of plant foods that does make intensive use of complex systems. And these complex systems that we're referring to are labor, land, capital, and machinery. So essentially, agriculture requires a greater investment of energy. You need more land to do agriculture. You need more people to work the land. You need more money to finance it. And you often need animals or machinery like tractors in order to work the land in an efficient way. Agriculture is farming at a really big scale, and horticulture is farming at a small scale. So the difference between horticulture and agriculture really comes down to size. Horticulture is done by families, by people living in villages. This is farming in your backyard to provide all of the fruits and vegetables that your family needs to survive. Agriculture is when people farm, these really, really big farms, farming one crop at a time in order to sell that to make a profit. So agriculture involves selling crops to other people, while horticulture is farming for yourself. The last type of cultivation is pastoralism, which is herding and tending to domesticated animals. Essentially, we're talking about shepherds. So let's get a little bit more in detail with each of these types of cultivation. As we said, horticulture is the cultivation of plant foods that does not make intensive use of complex systems. So this is farming for oneself and one's family. It's farming that people do by hand. So very simple tools are used in horticulture. Typically people use hoes and digging sticks are exactly what they sound like. They're sticks that you use to dig with. In this picture, we can see people in Papua New Guinea cassava farming, and you see that people are using hoes, they're getting down in the earth themselves. All of this farming is happening by hand. Horticulturalists have a few land management techniques. One is to let fields lie fallow, which means that after farming on the same piece of land for a few years, villagers will then leave a plot of land and farm in a new area for a while. And that's because if you farm the same piece of land over and over again year after year, eventually the plants will use up all of the nutrients in that soil. And so then planting there again isn't going to produce very robust crops. So after farming in a place, farming on the same plot of land for 3-4 years, horticulturalists will find a new little plot of land. Sometimes entire villages will move in order to access new land. And then eventually, after that old soil has had a chance to recharge, weeds have grown up and that organic material gets reincorporated into the soil. Rainwater will bring in nutrients. That soil sort of, becomes robust again. It becomes recharged and people can move back to the original plots and farm there again. Sometimes we refer to this as sort of like crop rotation. Horticulturalists also have to clear the land that they're going to farm, and so they often use something called slash and burn, and we see that in the picture here at the bottom right. In slash and burn, horticulturalists will cut down all of the vegetation that's existing in an area and then set it on fire. This makes for very easy clearing of the land to prepare it for farming, but also when organic material like plants and bushes and trees, when that material is burned, it releases nitrogen into the soil, and nitrogen is a natural fertilizer. So this is a really effective way of priming a piece of land for farming. We've talked a bit about gender roles in this class. Gender roles are the tasks and the jobs that are assigned to each gender in a community. And there are a number of tasks that can be done either by women or by men, depending on the culture we're looking at. Farming is one of those tasks that can either be a woman's task or a man's task. We see that in about 50% of horticultural societies, men are the primary farmers, and in 50%, women are the primary farmers. The interesting thing about this, though, is that in societies where men are the primary farmers, farming carries a lot of social status with it. There's a lot of prestige associated with farming in those communities. So men who are successful farmers have a lot of social status. But in societies where women are the primary producers, there is not social status attached to that job. And instead, farming is just one more thing that women are expected to do in their daily work. So here we see the same job, when it's performed by different genders, can have different levels of social prestige attached to it. Now this transition to cultivation is a very interesting one, because moving from nomadic hunter-gatherers into people who are bound to villages and to the land in a more substantial way, it's not an easy shift. It's not something that happens by accident. So it's worth exploring a little bit some of the reasons why humans switch from foraging lifestyles to cultivating lifestyles. And to do this, we have to go back a little bit in time, sort of set the stage. So let's go back to the last glacial maximum. This was the last time on Earth that it was extremely cold and that glaciers covered a very large part of the Earth. So the last glacial maximum lasted from about 27,000 years ago until 19,000 years ago. If we look at this map, you can sort of see a line tracking across the top part of the Earth. This line indicates the extent of glaciers. And glaciers are large masses of frozen water. During the last glacial maximum, we're essentially talking about an ice age. Big glaciers, very cold and also very dry. Because these glaciers, since they're made up of water, they sort of act like sponges and suck up water, which means that there's less water in the oceans, there's less water in the lakes. And because it's cold, less of that lake and ocean water is evaporating into the atmosphere, so it's also a lot drier. What we tend to see with world climate is that the Earth fluctuates between cold and dry, like during the last glacial maximum, and warm and wet. So up until about 19,000 years ago, the Earth was very cold and dry. But then, of course, the climate started to shift. And so after the last glacial maximum, the Earth becomes warmer and it becomes wetter as those glaciers retreat. For foragers who were alive at this time, the warmth and the wetness of the world would have produced some very favorable conditions. And this is certainly what we see in the Middle East, which is the zone we're going to focus on right now. The Middle East is this place where we call the Fertile Crescent, and that's because after the last glacial maximum, the increasing warmth and wetness of the planet really intensified in this part of the world. And, as you imagine, plants thrive very well under warm and wet conditions. There's a reason why greenhouses are warm and wet. So plants started to really thrive in this part of the world following 18,000 years ago, around 15,000 years ago. Animals do very well when there are lots of plants around. So as plant communities increase in density, animal communities also increase in density. Now we project this one more step forward and think about the foragers who are living in this part of the world. More plants, more animals. This is going to be a really good situation for any foragers living in this particular environment. And what we see after the last glacial maximum is that the foragers living here really started to expand their food resources. They started eating more types of plants and animals and grains. Sometimes we refer to this as the broad spectrum revolution because the diet of those hunter-gatherers becomes very, very broad. So this was a good time and a good place to be a hunter-gatherer. Let's consider the Middle East a little bit more carefully. In the Middle East, there are 4 major environmental zones, and these are distinguished on the basis of elevation. So there are some areas that are very high and mountainous, and some areas that are very low, very close to sea level. When we see a lot of variability in elevation, that's also going to affect the plants and animals that live along that gradient. So here's sort of a simplified version of these 4 environmental zones. Up at the top, the area of highest elevation is an area we call the high plateau. This is the most mountainous parts of the Middle East, and there would have been animals that were adapted to more mountainous living, so things like mountain goats, a lot of bushes and scrubby plants that would have provided some food resources, maybe nuts or some fruits. Going downslope, we have the hilly flanks. The hilly flanks are named this because there were lots of hills, and flank means next to or to the side of. So the hilly flanks were areas next to the high mountainous regions. Hilly flanks had lots of trees, good wood resources, fruits and nuts on these trees, animals like gazelle, which are quite tasty, and then also naturally occurring grasses. Grasses that today we know as the grains wheat and barley. Further down slope, we have the Piedmont steppe, which is sort of a foothill area. There weren't a lot of trees here, but again, there were bushes and animals like rabbits. Going further down slope, the lowest area of elevation, we have the alluvial desert. And when we use desert in this sense, it doesn't mean like the Sahara Desert where it's all sandy and really, really hot. Alluvial refers to basically a floodplain. So here we have a river coming down slopes, starting out as small streams and then gathering more and more water. In the alluvial desert, these big rivers will often flood out into a floodplain. And so you have permanent rivers moving through here, rivers with fish, with turtles, with resources that would be associated with these riverine environments. All in all, the Middle East had a lot of resources. And if you were a hunter-gatherer living in this area, you would have been doing very well for yourself. So wild animals and wild plants were abundant throughout the Middle East. And the foragers living in this area began to realize that they didn't need to be nomadic anymore. If we consider the reason why hunter-gatherers are nomadic, meaning that they're constantly on the move, the reason why hunter-gatherers move around is because they have to follow the food. On a yearly cycle, they have to always go where the food is. But if your food is always in one place, suddenly there's not really a reason to move anymore. So some hunter-gatherers in the Middle East started to settle down. They became sedentary, which means that they started to live their lives in settled year-round villages. And if we think about these 4 environmental zones, we can see that there might be some places that would be better to settle than others. And in the Middle East, people settled here in the hilly flanks. So from this position, you're able to access resources that were higher up in the mountains, as well as moving down into the lower zones. So the hilly flanks is where we see the first real villages in all of human history. One of the groups who settled in the Middle East and in the hilly flanks were people that we refer to as the NATUFIANs. We don't know what they called themselves. NATUFIANs is a name that archaeologists have given them, but the NATUFIANs lived in what is today Israel. They lived about 12 to 13,000 years ago until maybe 10,000 years ago. The NATUFIANs focused on collecting wild grains, those wheat and barley grains that we saw in the previous slide, and they also specialized in hunting gazelles. So they built these year-round villages with houses, with plaster floors, mud brick construction. They also built storage silos, and they started collecting some of those wild grains that they had been eating. They realized along the way that they didn't just have to go out and collect these grains every day. They could start collecting more than they needed on a daily basis and store them for later. So this was a real turning point in human history, realizing that people could cache food for a later time. The NATUFIANs are also very interesting because they have a number of unique ways of burying their dead. So here are two examples of burials from NATUFIAN villages. On the left, we have a burial from a village called Ain Malaha, and this is a woman who was buried with a small puppy underneath her left hand. In this particular village, puppy burials are pretty common, and we don't know exactly why people were buried with puppies like this, but it definitely indicates something. Maybe these puppies were there for companionship in the afterlife, or maybe they're there for protection. We can't say for sure what they mean, but we know that when we see items like this placed into graves with people, that it does mean something. Similarly, this burial from a site called Boker Taktit features a human that's buried with lots of different animal parts. There's part of a bear jaw in this burial, there are mountain lion bones, there's about 40 turtles, there's the wing of an eagle, there's also an extra human foot. This foot did not belong to this individual. We don't know exactly what this burial represents, but it's often referred to as a shaman burial. A shaman would be someone who is sort of the go-between from the natural to the supernatural world. And in many communities today and in the historic period, shamans are connected with animal imagery. So the fact that there are so many animal parts in this particular burial might indicate that this person held some special position as a shaman or a medicine man or a witch doctor, perhaps. Again, it's hard for us to reconstruct the actual meaning, but looking at the burials of people, we can definitely tell that there was meaning involved. So just to review, after the last glacial maximum, the world climate becomes warmer and it becomes wetter, and lots of different plant and animal foods could be found at different altitudes in the Middle East at different times of year. So NATUFIANs and others like them located themselves in the best position to exploit all of these resources, and that would have been in the hilly flanks. But world climate is constantly changing. So after about 11,000 years ago, the climate starts to change again, and it starts becoming colder and drier. As this happens, those plant resources started to shrink, and animal resources as well started to shrink, which would have had a definite effect on humans living in those areas. So after 11,000 years ago, we see these NATUFIAN villages starting to cluster around the rivers that were running through there. And people couldn't just live, sort of away from water sources anymore. People also might have started to intentionally plant those wild grains near the water sources to try to recreate the natural abundance that they had grown used to. Another thing to consider is that as humans became more conditioned to, regular food resource availability, more people in the population would have started surviving. And so as more people survive, then more food is necessary. In areas where it wasn't possible to settle near permanent water sources, people started moving into new areas to better access that water. And so people moved from the hilly flanks into the Piedmont steppe and started intentionally planting these wild grains closer to the river, again in an attempt to recreate the abundance of food they had gotten used to. So the earliest farming of plant foods began as an attempt to copy, in a less favorable environment, the dense stands of wheat and barley that grew wild in the hilly flanks. These are our first farmers. People who were just trying to make sure that they had enough food for themselves and their families, next week, next month, next year. They could not have possibly realized the effect that starting to intentionally plant foods would have had on world civilization. But this really kicked off a change in human populations and how people began to organize themselves. We also see at this time that people would move between these various environmental zones to extract other resources, like obsidian, which is a type of very sharp volcanic rock, or copper. We see people working metal for the first time. So this is marking a very big shift in human subsistence strategy. When natural resources that they had grown used to were no longer available, people tried to recreate those environments by intentionally planting their own food. Now, as people start intentionally planting food, a few things start to happen. And one of these things is that the plants themselves start to change by human interaction. And over the course of several thousand generations, the plants can become very, very different. And they become what we call domesticated. So most of the foods that we eat today are domesticated, meaning that they have changed in their physical characteristics through human intervention. And there are a few things that we can see differentiate wild plants and domesticated plants. For example, in wild plants, the seeds are smaller. The food parts of the plants are smaller. The stems of the plants tend to shatter more easily, so that when humans go around to try to collect the seeds, a lot of them fall to the ground. Also, the husks on the seeds or the food parts of the plants are typically harder in wild plants, making it more difficult for humans to get to the nutritious part inside. But as humans started intentionally farming these plants, they would often select for the characteristics that they found most desirable. So let's say if you had two wheat plants, and one of them had slightly bigger seeds. Which one would you plant for food the next year? You'd plant the one with the bigger seeds because you know that it will produce food with bigger seeds. So when humans keep doing this generation after generation, in domesticated plants we see that the seeds are larger, the food parts are larger. The axis or the stem of these plants are non-shattering, making it easier for humans to collect. And the husks are also more easily removed, or they're smaller, they're softer. So it's easier for humans to access those food parts of the plants. And this is possible because in any population, whether we're talking about plants or animals or humans, there's going to be variation. We know this from our discussions about how evolution happens. And so humans were intentionally selecting for the variations that were beneficial to them. After doing this for many, many generations, the plants change. And so here's an example of a plant that we call teosinte. It's a wild grass. But after humans selecting for the teosinte varieties that had more seeds, more kernels, teosinte eventually turned into something we could call maize. And certainly today, this thing that we know as corn, which is widespread around the world, this is completely engineered by humans selecting for better and better versions of the plant. But it started out in the wild as this. Bananas are the same way. This is a wild banana. You see it's full of seeds. There's very little of the fruit part of it, and it's very small. But as humans selected for banana characteristics that would produce more food, that would be larger, we eventually come to the bananas that we know today. So this domestication process, it wasn't the goal as people were initially farming. No one thought, oh, I'm going to take a banana and turn it into something really big and huge. But rather, it was sort of a happy accident. It's something that happened without people really realizing that they were doing it. But this is what leads to most of the foods that we eat today. Animals have also gone through the domestication process, where humans take wild animals and turn them into docile, docile beings that can live comfortably alongside humans. So domesticated animals tend to be larger than their wild counterparts. Domesticated animals are also almost always herd animals, which means that they naturally live in large packs, and there's some sort of hierarchy system within these herds. That means that there's an alpha. If you look at a pack of horses, there's always going to be one or two horses that are sort of the top of the chain there. And this type of hierarchy is really important in domesticated animals because that's how humans are able to control a large number of animals. If you have 300 horses, how in the world do you possibly control all of them? Well, you can't as a human. But if you can control the alpha of the herd, then all of the rest will follow. So the process of domesticating animals really requires that humans put themselves at the top of that hierarchy. Domesticated animals also have to have the certain, brain wiring to be able to have what we call a symbiotic relationship with humans, which means that we can have the type of relationship where, we give them something and they give us something. We give them food, they give us meat, or we give them food and they give us their physical power, like with horses. Not all animals have the brain capacity or the brain structure to be able to do this. Horses do. Horses have a brain wiring that makes them docile and comfortable and able to live alongside humans. But the zebra, which is a close relative of the horse, just can't. Zebras have never been domesticated because they are stubborn, they are ornery, and they just don't have the right temperament to be able to live alongside humans in that symbiotic way. Some wild animals can be tamed. For example, if you get a bear cub, when it's just a little baby and it grows up around humans, yeah, you can say that that animal is tamed, but it's not domesticated because domestication requires living alongside humans for generation after generation after generation. And there has to be some physical change, which is also why, having wild animals, even if they are quote unquote tamed, is still dangerous because their brains just aren't wired for it the way that other animals are. So this is how humans have changed plants and animals to live alongside them. And this process of domestication, this early stage of horticulture, has happened numerous times around the world. We were looking at an example from the Middle East here, where things like wheat and barley and pistachios and chickpeas were all domesticated, as well as sheep and goats. But lots of other places have experienced this transition from horticulture to agriculture. So the Mediterranean, for example, we get the domestication of grapes and olives. In Central America, we have the domestication of maize or corn. South America, we have the domestication of potatoes, lima beans, also alpacas and llamas. In Africa, we have the domestication of millet and, very importantly, coffee. In China, the domestication of rice, not to mention animals like pigs and chickens. So this process of domesticating plants and animals is something that happens lots of times over the last 10,000 years. And in each of these scenarios, it's because humans are trying to establish enough food resources to meet all of their needs. You'll also probably pick out the fact that many of these places are where we see some of the earliest civilizations, the earliest major civilizations. So the Middle East has Mesopotamia, Ur, Sumer. You have these very, very early civilizations occurring here. In Mesoamerica, you have the Aztecs. In South America, you have the Inca. In China, you have dynastic empires that stretch back thousands of years. Farming is really at the root of all of these ancient civilizations. And as more people are farming, there becomes this switch from horticulture, which is small-scale farming in villages, to agriculture. Farming at a much, much larger scale so that you have more people incorporated into the system. So again, agriculture is the cultivation of plant foods that does make intensive use of complex systems. You have much more land, therefore you need more people to farm that land. You need more money to pay the people and to finance the farming. You need machinery, like draft animals that you can see in the picture to the right here, or in the modern day, machinery like tractors or combines. Agriculture also requires some land management techniques. One of these is irrigation, which is pulling off water from rivers to water a larger area of land. So effective water management is very important in agriculture. Another land management strategy is terracing. And this is when people do agriculture in more hilly areas. Agriculture often requires very flat land, especially if you're using animals or machinery to farm. But not all of the world is flat. So in areas where there are a lot of hills, people will actually cut steps into these hills to create a series of flat surfaces. And this is a practice that has been used all over the planet for thousands and thousands of years. As people start practicing agriculture, this very large-scale farming, there develops a sort of feedback loop. The more farming you do, the more people in your community survive. But then as more people are surviving, you need to farm more food to keep them all alive. So you farm more food and then more people stay alive. All right, well now we need to farm a little bit more. So once people get involved in agriculture, they really get stuck in it. And we don't see societies entering into agriculture and then retreating back into horticulture or foraging lifestyles, because populations are just so large that it's necessary to keep doing it just to keep sort of the status quo, just to keep people alive and persisting as they are used to. Our final form of cultivation is pastoralism, and this is herding and tending to domesticated animals. Pastoralists are often nomadic, meaning that they're moving around throughout the year, just like foragers, except the difference is that pastoralists, again, are working with domesticated animals like cattle or sheep or horses or camels. And the reason why they need to keep moving constantly is because they have to lead these animals to grazing land so that all of the animals can be fed throughout the year. Pastoralists use these animals that they tend to for a couple of different resources, and we call these primary and secondary resources. Primary resources are things like meat and blood, and secondary resources are milk, wool, and transport. And it should be pretty obvious that pastoralists tend to use secondary resources more than they use primary resources. For example, if you were a Maasai cattle herder living in Kenya or Tanzania and you had 100 cattle, it would be a better use of your resources to use these cattle for milk, to use them for transportation, or to use them to trade to horticulturalists or agriculturalists for other types of foods. Because if you were to slaughter one of your cattle every day or even every week for food, then you would quickly deplete your cattle resources and you would end up with nothing. And in pastoralist societies, animals are wealth, animals are money. So you don't want to sacrifice these things unless it's a very good reason. Now, blood is also considered a primary resource, although there are societies, there are pastoralist cultures that use blood without killing the animals. It's possible to open up a small vein in an animal, drain out a bit of blood, kind of like a blood donation, and then sew the animal back up. And then that blood, which is full of nutrients, can be used in the regular part of the diet. So many pastoralists are nomadic, but there's also a special technique or a special style of nomadism called transhumance. In a transhuman society, part of the group is nomadic, and it's typically the men. The men will take the animals out on their yearly nomadic migrations. But then the other half of the community, the women, the small children, the elderly individuals, will live a settled life in villages. So in transhumance, you have part of the group staying put and part of the group constantly moving. And this is a great way of sort of remaining rooted to a place and having the community that stays in the villages practicing small-scale horticulture while still taking advantage of the resources involved with pastoralism. So those are our three types of cultivation: horticulture, agriculture, and pastoralism. All three of them depend on the use of domesticated plants and animals. And the shift from foraging to cultivation marks a really important time in human history. First starting about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East, but then we see it also occurring in China 5,000 years ago, in South America 5,000 years ago, in Mesoamerica. It crops up all over the planet at different times throughout human history. But it's this transition to cultivation that marks the real beginnings of what we call big-scale civilizations. And once people start farming, once they start settling down, we start seeing the development of much more complex social structures. We see more social stratification. We start to see more economic inequality because people are starting to acquire things. People are starting to amass personal wealth. And these are the origins of all of the differences that we see in cultures today.